Her scream echoed through the dusty cantina like a prayer no one wanted to hear. Isabella Rodriguez collapsed to her knees on the splintered wooden stage, her wrist bound so tight the rope had carved angry red lines into her olive skin. The white checkered shirt she wore was torn at the shoulder, hanging loose and barely covering her trembling form. Dirt streaked her face, mixing with tears she refused to let fall. She was 19 years old, but her dark eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much, suffered too long. Every bruise on her arms told a story of the bandits who'd torn her from her family's small farm 3 weeks ago. Every cut spoke of the journey north, where she'd been passed from one set of cruel hands to another until she ended up here, on display like livestock in this god-forsaken saloon. The crowd of men pressed closer, their faces twisted with greed and something darker. Whiskey breath and tobacco smoke filled the air. The cantina reeked of sweat, leather, and desperation. To them, she wasn't a person with dreams and fears. She was merchandise, a prize to be won. $50 to start, bellowed Martinez, the auction master, a fat man with gold teeth who ran the human trade through this part of Texas. Fresh from Mexico, untouched and ready to serve any man's needs. Laughter erupted from the crowd like gunfire. Coins clinked as rough hands dug into worn pockets. Someone shouted, 60! Another voice called, 75! Isabella tried to cover herself, but the bindings cut deeper with every movement. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Martinez had said starving girls looked more desperate, fetched higher prices. She bit her cracked lips until she tasted blood, scanning the sea of leering faces for even one hint of mercy. There was none. Only men who saw her as flesh, as property, as something to be used and discarded. The bidding climbed higher. $80, $90, $100. Each number felt like a nail in her coffin, sealing her fate to whatever monster could pay the most. Then, cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, came a voice she'd never heard before. Deep, gravelly, steady as stone. 150. The cantina fell silent as a tomb. Every head turned toward the batwing doors, where a tall figure stood silhouetted against the dying light of day. He stepped inside slow and deliberate, his weathered boots barely making a sound on the warped floorboards. He was a cowboy, maybe 50 years old, with skin bronzed by decades under the desert sun. A red bandana circled his neck, and a wide-brimmed hat cast shadows over eyes that seemed to see everything. His hand rested easy on the grip of a well-worn Colt .45, but he wasn't threatening anyone. Not yet. Isabella stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was this man? And why did his presence make the whole room hold its breath? Jake Carter had seen enough evil in his 48 years to recognize it from a mile away. And right now, staring at the terrified girl on that makeshift stage, he was looking pure evil in the face. He'd only stopped in Perdition Creek to water his horse and buy supplies. The last thing he'd expected was to stumble into a human auction in broad daylight. But here he was, watching grown men bid on a girl who couldn't be much older than his own daughter would have been, if she'd lived. Sarah would have been 21 now, would have had her mother's green eyes and stubborn streak, would have fought tooth and nail before letting anyone put her in chains. The girl on the stage, Isabella, he'd heard them call her, had that same fire in her dark eyes, even as terror tried to drown it out. That spark reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to protect. 150 going once, Martinez called out, sweat beading on his forehead. The fat man's eyes darted nervously to Jake, clearly unsettled by the stranger's calm demeanor. Any other bids? This lovely senorita won't last long on the market. A grizzled miner near the bar spat tobacco juice and raised his hand. 160. I'll take real good care of her. His companions laughed, the sound ugly as sin. Jake's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed once against his gun belt, a gesture that made several men take a step back. Those who knew him understood that Jake Carter wasn't a man you wanted to cross. Those who didn't were about to learn. 200, Jake said quietly. The words carried across the room like thunder. The miner's face went red. Now hold on there, stranger. I was bidding fair and square. Jake turned those cold gray eyes on him. Still am. 200 in gold coin. Right here. Right now. He pulled a leather pouch from his vest, coins clinking heavy inside. Unless you got something better to offer. The miner looked around for support, but found none. Even his drinking buddies had suddenly discovered the bottoms of their glasses were mighty interesting. $200 was more money than most of these men saw in a year. Martinez licked his lips, practically drooling at the sight of that gold. 200. Going once. Going twice. He paused, giving the room one last chance to object. When silence greeted him, he slammed his gavel down hard. Sold! To the gentleman in the red bandana. The crowd began to disperse, muttering and shooting dark looks Jake's way. He ignored them all, stepping forward to the stage where Isabella knelt frozen in place. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd thought. Barely out of childhood, really. The bruises on her arms made his blood boil. Easy there, miss, he said softly, pulling out a folding knife. I'm just going to cut these ropes. Isabella flinched away, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Please, she whispered in accented English. Please don't hurt me. Something cracked inside Jake's chest. I ain't gonna hurt you, girl. That's a promise. He cut through her bonds with quick, efficient movements, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. The moment her wrists were free, Isabella rubbed the raw marks, wincing at the pain. Jake shrugged out of his leather duster and wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but at least it covered her properly. You paid for me, Isabella said, her voice barely audible. Now do it. Get it over with. Jake went still. He'd heard those words before, in different circumstances, from another girl who'd given up hope. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His daughter Sarah, found too late in that burned-out cabin, whispering those same defeated words before the light faded from her eyes. No, ma'am, he said firmly. I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom. Isabella's dark eyes widened in confusion and disbelief. I don't understand. Don't reckon you need to. Not right now. Jake glanced around the cantina, noting how many men were still watching, still calculating. But we need to get moving. This place ain't safe for either of us anymore. He helped her down from the stage, his hand steady at her elbow. Outside, the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Jake's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Dusty, waited patiently at the hitching rail. Can you ride? Jake asked. Isabella nodded, though he could see exhaustion weighing heavy on her slight frame. See, yes. Jake boosted her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. She tensed at the contact, every muscle coiled tight as a spring. He could feel her trembling through the leather duster. Easy, he murmured, the same tone he'd use with a spooked horse. We're just going to ride out slow and peaceful. Nobody's going to hurt you. They walked Dusty through the dusty streets of Perdition Creek, past the saloons and gambling halls and houses of ill repute. A few men watched them go, but none were stupid enough to challenge an armed man for his property. That's what they saw Isabella as now. Jake's property, bought and paid for. The thought made him sick. Once they cleared the town limits, Jake urged Dusty into an easy lope across the desert. The stars were coming out overhead, brilliant and cold in the vast darkness. Isabella sat rigid in front of him, afraid to relax, afraid to trust. What's your name, miss? Jake asked after they'd ridden in silence for an hour. Isabella, she whispered. Isabella Rodriguez. Well, Miss Rodriguez, I'm Jake Carter. And I want you to know something. Soon as we find the next town with a sheriff, I'm going to see about getting you back to your family. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with grief. My family is dead. The bandits. They killed my papa, my mama, my little brother. I am alone. Jake's hands tightened on the reins. Another family destroyed, another girl left with nothing but pain and fear. The West was full of such stories, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. Then we'll figure something else out, he said. But I promise you this, you'll never be sold again. Not while I draw breath. Isabella turned slightly to look at him over her shoulder. In the starlight, her face was all angles and shadows, beautiful and heartbreaking. Why? She asked. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with memories he'd tried to bury. Finally, he said, let's just say I got my reasons. And leave it at that. They rode on through the night, two strangers bound together by circumstance and tragedy, heading toward an uncertain future under the endless desert sky. Dawn broke pale and thin over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Jake had been riding most of the night, following cattle trails and deer paths that would be hard for anyone to track. His back ached and his eyes burned with fatigue, but he knew better than to stop too soon. Men like those in Perdition Creek didn't take kindly to losing their entertainment. Isabella had fallen asleep sometime after midnight, her head lolling back against his chest. In sleep, she looked even younger, the worry lines smoothed from her face. Jake found himself adjusting his grip to keep her steady, protecting her even in unconsciousness. When she stirred as the sun climbed higher, Jake guided Dusty toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a creek bed. The trees would provide shade and cover, and both horse and riders needed water. Where are we? Isabella asked, her voice thick with sleep. About 20 miles north of Perdition Creek, Jake said, dismounting. Far enough to rest a spell. He helped her down, noting how she swayed on her feet. When had she last eaten a proper meal? From the hollow look in her cheeks, it had been days. Sit, he said, pointing to a fallen log near the creek. I'll see what I can rustle up for breakfast. Isabella sat slowly, Jake's duster still wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She watched warily as he unsaddled Dusty and let the horse drink from the stream. Her dark eyes tracked his every movement, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Jake pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, along with a battered tin cup. It wasn't much, but it would keep body and soul together. He filled the cup with clear creek water and brought it to Isabella along with the food. It ain't fancy, he said, but it'll fill the empty spots. Isabella took the water gratefully, drinking deep before starting on the jerky. She ate like someone who'd learned not to waste food, quick and efficient. Jake settled across from her, chewing his own meager breakfast and studying the landscape. The desert stretched endless in all directions, broken only by mesas and canyons carved by ancient rivers. It was beautiful in its harshness, but unforgiving to those who didn't know its ways. Jake had been born to this land, raised on cattle ranches and mining camps. He knew where to find water, where to shelter from storms, how to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. And right now, all his instincts were screaming that trouble was already on their trail. Why did you really buy me? Isabella asked suddenly. Jake looked at her, this girl woman who'd seen too much horror for her years. Told you last night, I bought your freedom. But why? She pressed. Men don't spend gold on strangers without wanting something in return. Jake was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth he could bear to share. Finally, he said, I had a daughter once, about your age. Sarah. Isabella's eyes softened. What happened to her? Raiders, Jake said simply. Burned out our ranch while I was away on business. By the time I got back, he trailed off, the old pain still sharp as broken glass. Found her in the ashes. She'd been used, left to die. Isabella sucked in a sharp breath. Lo siento. I'm sorry. Been carrying that weight for 3 years now, Jake continued, telling myself there was nothing I could have done different. Then I saw you up on that stage and... He shrugged. Maybe this is my chance to get it right. They finished eating in silence, both lost in their own dark thoughts. Jake was checking Dusty's shoes when he heard it, the distant rumble of hoofbeats, still miles away but getting closer. Son of a bitch, he muttered. What is it? Isabella asked, alarm sharpening her voice. Company coming, and I don't reckon they're the friendly type. Jake quickly resaddled Dusty, his movements swift and economical. We need to move. Now. Isabella scrambled to her feet, still clutching the duster around herself. Are they coming for me? Most likely. Jake helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Man like Martinez don't like losing money. Probably sent some boys to collect his property. They splashed across the creek and headed up a steep, rocky slope that would hide their tracks. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder. Jake counted at least 4 riders, maybe more. Not impossible odds, but not good ones either. Hold tight, he told Isabella as Dusty scrambled up the loose stone. This is going to get rough. They crested the ridge just as their pursuers came into view. 4 men on horseback, led by a lanky fellow in a black hat that Jake recognized as Martinez's top enforcer. A killer named Cleet Rawson, who'd shoot a man for the change in his pockets. Jake cursed under his breath. This wasn't just about getting Isabella back. This was about teaching him a lesson for interfering with their business. They rode hard across broken country, Dusty's hooves ringing on stone and sending small avalanches cascading down into the valleys below. The big gelding was strong and sure-footed, but he was carrying double and their pursuers were gaining ground. There! Isabella pointed to a narrow canyon cutting between 2 mesas. We can hide there! Jake shook his head. Canyon's a trap. They get us in there. We're finished. Instead, he guided Dusty toward a massive formation of red sandstone that rose from the desert floor like a sleeping giant. The stone was riddled with caves and passages worn smooth by countless years of wind and rain. They dismounted at the base of the formation, Jake quickly leading Dusty into a narrow cleft that would hide the horse from view. He grabbed his rifle from the scabbard and checked his ammunition. Can you shoot? He asked Isabella. She nodded grimly. My papa taught me. Before. Jake handed her his spare pistol, a nickel-plated Remington that had served him well over the years. Stay back in the rocks. Don't come out unless I call for you. Isabella's fingers closed around the gun's grip. What about you? I'm going to have a conversation with those boys about the proper way to treat a lady. The riders had spotted their trail and were approaching the stone formation, spreading out to cover all the exits. Jake found a good position among the boulders, with clear sight lines and solid cover. He settled in to wait. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that spanged off the rock inches from his head. Jake rolled to new cover and returned fire, his bullet taking one of the riders clean off his horse. That's for Sarah, he whispered. The battle was joined in earnest now, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Jake was outnumbered, but he had the high ground and 20 years of fighting experience. He made every shot count, driving the attackers back with disciplined fire. But ammunition wouldn't last forever, and more men might be coming. Jake needed to end this quick and permanent. Rawson, he called out during a lull in the shooting. This is between you and me. Let's settle it proper. The lanky gunman stepped into view, his black hat tilted at a cocky angle. You got something belongs to Martinez, stranger. Hand over the girl, and we'll call it square. Counter offer, Jake replied. You ride out now and I won't kill the rest of you. Rawson laughed. Big talk for a man outnumbered 3-1. The final exchange was swift and brutal. Rawson went for his gun with the confidence of a man who'd never been beaten. Jake's Colt cleared leather a split second faster, the heavy slug punching through the gunman's chest and spinning him around. The remaining 2 riders looked at their fallen leader, then at the grim-faced cowboy standing among the rocks like an avenging angel. Without a word, they wheeled their horses and rode hard for the horizon. Jake watched them go, then walked down to check on the bodies. All dead, including Rawson. Good. Dead men couldn't carry tales back to Martinez. Isabella, he called. It's over. You can come out now. She emerged from her hiding place, the pistol still clutched in her hands. Her face was pale but determined. Are they? Dead or gone, Jake confirmed. We're safe. For now. Isabella looked at the bodies, then at Jake. For the first time since he'd first seen her, she smiled. A small, fragile thing, but real. Gracias, she whispered. Thank you. Jake tipped his hat. Just returning the favor, miss. Now let's get moving before more show up. 3 days of hard riding brought them to the town of Esperanza, a dusty collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts that clung to life around a natural spring. It wasn't much to look at, but it was civilization, a place where Isabella could find work, maybe even passage to somewhere safer. Jake had barely spoken during their journey, maintaining the same careful distance he'd kept since leaving Perdition Creek. He was kind but remote, helping her down from the horse each evening, but never touching her longer than necessary. Isabella found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to understand this complex man who'd saved her life. They took rooms at the town's only hotel. Separate rooms, Jake was careful to specify to the desk clerk. Isabella bathed for the first time in weeks, scrubbing away the dirt and fear until her skin was raw and pink. The hotel proprietor's wife, a motherly Mexican woman named Senora Valdez, brought her a simple blue dress that fit reasonably well. "You look like a proper lady again, mija," the older woman said kindly. "That hombre, he treat you well." Isabella nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what Jake's intentions were. He'd kept his word about not hurting her, but what came next? She had no money, no family, nowhere to go. In the morning, would he simply abandon her here like unwanted baggage? She found Jake on the hotel's small veranda, staring out at the desert with that distant look she'd come to recognize. 2 glasses of whiskey sat on the table beside him, one untouched. "For me?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Figured you might need it," Jake said. "Been a hard few days." Isabella sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn down her throat and spread warmth through her chest. "What happens now?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Been thinking about that. Esperanza's got a school teacher moving on to California. Senora Valdez says they'll need someone to replace her. You can read and write?" "See. Yes. My mama taught me both English and Spanish." "Good. Teaching's honest work. Respectable. You could make a life here." Isabella studied his weathered face in the lamplight. "And you? Will you stay?" Something flickered in Jake's gray eyes. Longing, maybe, or regret. "I'm not the staying kind, miss. Got too many ghosts following me around." "Everyone has ghosts, Senor Jake. The question is whether you let them drive you or find peace with them." Jake looked at her sharply. "You're young to be talking about peace and ghosts." "Young?" Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I watched bandits murder my family. I was sold like an animal. I've seen enough evil to last several lifetimes. Young is something I stopped being the day they killed my papa." They sat in comfortable silence, sharing the whiskey and watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. Isabella found herself studying Jake's profile. The strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow, the silver threading through his brown hair. "Tell me about your daughter," she said softly. Jake's hand tightened around his glass. "Sarah? She was everything good in the world. Smart as a whip, stubborn as a mule, could ride better than most men by the time she was 12. Had her mama's green eyes and her daddy's temper. She sounds wonderful." "She was." Jake drained his whiskey in one gulp. "The night she died, I wasn't there. Was in Tucson, selling cattle. Thought I'd be gone 3 days, but the buyers wanted to haggle. Stayed an extra week." His voice turned bitter. "1 week. If I'd come home when I was supposed to—" "The raiders would have killed you too," Isabella said gently. "Or maybe they would have waited for a better time. You cannot blame yourself for evil done by evil men." Jake turned to look at her. Really look at her, for the first time since they'd met. "You sound like her sometimes, Sarah. She was always trying to make me see the good in things." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks but didn't look away. "Perhaps she still is, through me." The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric. Then Jake abruptly stood, scraping his chair back. "It's late. You should get some rest." "Jake, wait." Isabella rose too, reaching out to touch his arm. "I know you think you're protecting me by keeping your distance, but I'm not made of glass. I won't break." "You don't understand," Jake said roughly. "You don't know what I am. I know you're the man who saved my life. I know you've been nothing but kind and respectful, even when you had every legal right to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "That's just it," Jake said. "You're grateful. You think you owe me something, but gratitude ain't the same as other feelings." Isabella stepped closer, close enough to smell the leather and sage scent of him, close enough to see the war raging in his gray eyes. "And what if it's not just gratitude? What if it's something else?" "You're 19 years old," Jake said desperately. "I'm nearly 50. I've got blood on my hands and a past that would give you nightmares. You deserve better than a broken-down old cowboy with more enemies than friends." "Should I not decide what I deserve?" Isabella asked. "You gave me my freedom, remember?" That includes the freedom to choose. Jake stared at her for a long moment, his internal struggle written clearly on his face. Finally, he reached up and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers soft against her skin. Isabella, he whispered. Sweet girl, you don't know what you're asking. Then tell me, she said, covering his hand with hers. Help me understand. Jake closed his eyes, leaning into her touch despite himself. I ain't been with a woman since my wife died. Didn't think I ever would be again. But you. God help me, Isabella. You make me want things I thought were buried with Sarah and her mother. Then why fight it? Because you've been through hell. Because you might be confusing rescue with love. Because I'm too damn old and too damn broken to be any good for a woman like you. Isabella smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Jake had seen from her. For a smart man, you say some very stupid things. Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was soft and hesitant at first, then deeper as Jake's resolve crumbled. His arms came around her, pulling her against him as if she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed. This is crazy, he whispered. See, Isabella agreed. Completely loco. Does that change how you feel? Jake opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. Not as a victim to be protected or a burden to be managed, but as a woman. A strong, beautiful, fierce woman who'd survived hell and come out the other side with her spirit intact. No, he said quietly. It doesn't change a damn thing. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no holding back. Years of loneliness and grief melted away under the warmth of her lips, the soft sounds she made as he held her closer. Your room or mine, Isabella whispered against his mouth. Jake pulled back slightly, searching her face. You sure about this? Because once we cross this line... I'm sure, Isabella said firmly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Jake swept her up in his arms, carrying her through the hotel lobby and up the stairs to his room. Behind the desk, Senora Valdez smiled knowingly and returned to her knitting. In the morning, Isabella woke wrapped in Jake's arms, her head pillowed on his chest. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden rectangles on the floor. For the first time in months, she felt safe, protected, loved. Jake stirred beneath her, his arms tightening around her waist. Morning, beautiful, he murmured into her hair. Buenos dias, she replied, tilting her head to look at him. Any regrets? Jake's gray eyes were soft and warm as summer rain. Only that I waited so long to do that. Isabella smiled and kissed the hollow of his throat, tasting salt and warmth and the promise of a future she'd never dared to dream of. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. 2 weeks in Esperanza had given both Jake and Isabella a taste of what normal life might look like. She'd started teaching at the small schoolhouse, working with a dozen children whose faces lit up when she spoke to them in rapid Spanish or told them stories of far-off places. Jake had taken work at the livery stable, his skill with horses quickly earning the respect of the town's ranchers. They'd fallen into an easy routine, breakfast together at the hotel, stolen moments during the day when their paths crossed, quiet evenings on the veranda talking about everything and nothing. Isabella had never known such contentment was possible, which was exactly when their past caught up with them. Jake was shoeing a fractious mare when young Tommy Hutchins came running into the stable, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Mr. Jake! Mr. Jake! The boy gasped. My pa says to tell you there's riders coming. Bad-looking ones. Jake's blood turned to ice water. He'd known this day would come eventually. Men like Martinez didn't forgive and forget. They just took their time planning revenge. How many? Jake asked, already reaching for his gun belt. 6, maybe 7. They got rifles and mean looks. Pa says they've been asking questions about a girl and a cowboy with a red bandana. Jake buckled on his Colt and checked the cylinder. Fully loaded, but 7 men were long odds even for someone with his experience. He needed to get Isabella somewhere safe before the shooting started. Tommy, you run home to your mama and you stay there, you hear? Don't come out no matter what happens. The boy nodded and scampered away. Jake strode across the dusty street toward the schoolhouse, his mind racing through options. None of them were good. Isabella looked up as he entered the small adobe building, her face brightening with a smile that made his chest ache. She was so beautiful, so full of life and hope. How could he tell her that death was riding toward them across the desert? Jake, I wasn't expecting. Her smile faded as she saw his expression. What's wrong? We got trouble coming, Jake said tersely. Martinez sent more men. 7 of them, from what I hear. The color drained from Isabella's face, but she didn't panic. That was one of the things he loved about her. Her core of steel beneath the softness. What do we do? She asked, already moving toward her desk where she kept her belongings. You're going to get somewhere safe while I handle this. No, Isabella's voice was firm. We face this together. Isabella, be reasonable. 7 guns against 1 ain't odds any sane man would take. I need to know you're safe before you what? Isabella turned to face him, her dark eyes flashing with anger and fear. Before you get yourself killed playing hero? No, Jake, I won't lose you. Not after everything we've been through. Jake grabbed her shoulders, his fingers gentle, despite the urgency in his voice. Listen to me, love. I've been fighting men like this my whole life. It's what I do, but I can't do it if I'm worried about keeping you safe at the same time. Tears sparked in Isabella's eyes, but her jaw was set with stubborn determination. And I can't hide while the man I love faces 7 killers alone. We're stronger together, Jake. You know we are. Before Jake could argue further, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the schoolhouse walls. He moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 7 riders had entered the main street, spread out in a line like they owned the town. At their head rode a man Jake recognized from wanted posters, Diego Vasquez, a killer who'd learned his trade in the Revolution and perfected it in the borderlands. Shit, Jake muttered. What is it? Vasquez. Martinez must be paying top dollar to bring him into this. Isabella joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. The man in the middle? With the scarred face? That's him. Killed more men than cholera, and twice as mean. Jake checked his rifle, wishing he had more ammunition. Isabella, please. There's a root cellar behind the hotel. Mrs. Valdez will hide you there. Jake Carter! The voice boomed across the street, heavily accented but clear. We know you're here. Come out and face what you owe. Jake moved toward the door, but Isabella caught his arm. Wait, there might be another way. Like what? Isabella was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then her face lit up with sudden inspiration. The children, their families. How do you think they'll react to armed men threatening their teacher? Jake frowned. I don't follow. This isn't Perdition Creek, Jake. This is a real town, with real families who care about each other. Those men out there are strangers. We're not. Before Jake could stop her, Isabella strode to the schoolhouse bell and began ringing it. Not the gentle chimes that called children to class, but the urgent clanging that meant emergency. Trouble. All hands needed. Isabella, what are you doing? Leveling the odd, she said grimly, continuing to ring the bell. Within minutes, men began emerging from buildings along the street. Shopkeepers with shotguns, ranchers with rifles, even old Senor Martinez, the blacksmith, carrying a hammer that could cave in a man's skull. They moved with purpose, taking positions behind water troughs and hitching posts, their faces grim and determined. Diego Vasquez looked around with growing unease. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd come to collect 1 man and 1 woman, not fight an entire town. You made a mistake, gringo, he called out. This is between you and us. These people don't need to die. Jake stepped out of the schoolhouse, Isabella beside him despite his protests. He was surprised to see Sheriff Ben Morrison emerging from the jail with a shotgun in his hands and a badge on his chest that meant something in this town. Actually, Diego, Sheriff Morrison called out, I think you're the one made the mistake. See, Miss Rodriguez here is our school teacher, and Mr. Carter's been helping folks with their horses. That makes them part of our community, and we protect our own. Vasquez spat in the dust. 1 woman ain't worth dying for, lawman. That's where you're wrong, came a voice from across the street. It was Senora Valdez, holding an ancient carbine that looked like it had seen service in the Mexican War. Every woman is worth protecting, every child. That's what separates us from animals like you." More voices joined in, a chorus of support that made Jake's throat tight with unexpected emotion. These people barely knew him, but they were willing to fight for him, for Isabella, for the idea that some things were worth standing up for. "Last chance, Vasquez," Sheriff Morrison called out. "Ride out now, and we'll call it even. Stay and find out what happens to men who threaten our neighbors." For a tense moment, the street was silent except for the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Then Vasquez made his choice. His hand dropped toward his gun. The street erupted in gunfire. Jake threw Isabella to the ground behind a water trough, covering her body with his own as bullets whined overhead. The townspeople gave as good as they got, their disciplined fire driving the killers back toward their horses. Vasquez himself made a break for the schoolhouse, probably thinking he could use it as a fortress. Jake intercepted him halfway, the two men rolling in the dust as they fought for control of Vasquez's rifle. The Mexican was younger and stronger, but Jake had desperation on his side. He managed to get his knife out, driving it between Vasquez's ribs with a grunt of effort. The killer's eyes went wide with shock, then glazed over as life fled from them. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Martinez's men were dead, and the other 4 were riding hard for the horizon, bleeding from various wounds. Not one townsperson had been seriously hurt. Jake helped Isabella to her feet, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief. Around them, the people of Esperanza were checking on each other, making sure everyone was safe. "It's over," Jake said, hardly believing it himself. "See," Isabella agreed, leaning into his embrace. "It's over." Sheriff Morrison approached, his weathered face creased with a smile. "Reckon Martinez will think twice before sending more men. Word travels fast in this territory. By tomorrow, every gunfighter from here to El Paso will know what happens to folks who threaten Esperanza." Jake nodded gratefully. "We owe you all a debt." "No debt," Senora Valdez said firmly. "Just neighbors helping neighbors. That's how civilized people live." As the crowd dispersed and life slowly returned to normal, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he had a home worth defending. Isabella squeezed his hand, her dark eyes shining with tears of relief and joy. "What are you thinking about?" Jake looked around at the town that had risked everything to protect them, then down at the woman who'd brought love back into his life. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe it's time I learned how to stay in one place." Isabella's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Martinez himself arrived 3 days later with 20 men and a wagon full of weapons. This wasn't about recovering property anymore. It was about reputation. Word had spread across the territory that a fat slave trader had been humiliated by a small desert town. If Martinez didn't make an example of Esperanza, every settlement from Texas to California would think they could defy him. Jake spotted the dust cloud from the schoolhouse roof where he'd been repairing shingles. 20 riders meant serious trouble, more than the town could handle with shopkeepers and farmers, no matter how brave they were. "Isabella," he called down, "ring the bell." Emergency. Within minutes, Sheriff Morrison and the other town leaders had gathered in the street. Jake climbed down from the roof, his face grim. "How many?" Morrison asked. 20 plus Martinez himself. They're not coming to talk." The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. 20's a lot, more than we can handle head on. "We could run," suggested Dr. Henley, the town physician. "Pack up what we can carry and head for Tucson." "And let them burn everything we've built?" Senora Valdez shook her head firmly. "This is our home. We don't run from rats." Jake studied the faces around him. Good people who'd shown him more loyalty in 3 weeks than he'd known in years of drifting. They deserved better than to die for his mistakes. "This is my fight," he said quietly. "I'll ride out and meet them. Maybe we can settle this without involving the town." "Like hell," Morrison snorted. "You think Martinez will stop with you? He'll burn us out anyway, just to make his point." Isabella stepped forward, her teaching clothes replaced by riding gear and her face set with determination. "Jake's right that this started with us. But the sheriff is right too. Martinez won't stop here. Men like him don't leave witnesses." "So what do you suggest?" asked Tom Hutchins, Tommy's father. Isabella looked around the circle of faces, then at Jake. We make our stand here, but we do it smart. What do you mean? Jake asked. I grew up on stories of how my grandfather fought the Americanos in the war. 20 men spread out across open ground are vulnerable, but 20 men channeled into a killing ground. She smiled grimly. That's different. Jake caught on immediately. Block the main street. Force them to come at us single file. Exactly. Wagons across the road at both ends. Barricades in the alleys. Turn the whole town into a fortress. Sheriff Morrison grinned. Miss Rodriguez, you've got a devious mind. I like that in a woman. They had less than an hour before Martinez arrived, but the people of Esperanza worked with the efficiency of ants. Wagons were overturned to block the street. Windows were boarded up with firing slits cut through. Women and children were moved to the strongest building, the stone church at the town center. Jake positioned himself at the main barricade with Sheriff Morrison and 6 other men. Isabella insisted on staying with them despite his protests. We settled this argument already, she said, checking her rifle. Where you go, I go. Jake wanted to argue further, but there wasn't time. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. Martinez appeared at the edge of town like a vision from hell. A massive man in expensive clothes, riding a black stallion and flanked by killers who looked like they'd crawled out of nightmares. He surveyed the barricades with amusement. Very clever, he called out in accented English, but you only delay the inevitable. I have all day. And we have all the ammunition in 3 counties, Sheriff Morrison shouted back. Plus friends in Tucson who'll come looking if we don't send word by sunset. Martinez's smile faded. He knew as well as anyone that the territorial militia didn't take kindly to large armed groups threatening their towns. Here's my offer, Martinez continued. Give me the girl and the cowboy, and the rest of you live. Refuse, and I burn this place to ash. The answer came not from Morrison or Jake, but from a dozen voices raised in defiant chorus. Go to hell! Martinez's face darkened with rage. He raised his hand and brought it down in a chopping motion. His men spurred their horses forward, guns blazing. The battle for Esperanza was brutal and chaotic. Martinez's men quickly learned that charging prepared positions was a good way to die, but they kept coming anyway. The slave trader had promised them a fortune in gold, and greed made men stupid. Jake worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and perfectly placed. Beside him, Isabella proved to be as deadly as she was beautiful, her bullets finding their marks with the skill her grandfather had taught her father, who'd passed the knowledge to her. The first wave broke against the barricades like surf against rocks. 6 men down, Martinez pulling back to regroup. But the townspeople had taken casualties too. Dr. Henley with a bullet in his shoulder, young Tommy Hutchins grazed across the scalp. They'll try to flank us next, Jake warned. Come around through the alleys. Already thought of that, Morrison said grimly. Got men posted at every back door and window. The second assault came from 3 directions at once. Martinez had learned from his mistakes, spreading his remaining men thin, but forcing the defenders to split their fire. For a few terrifying minutes, it looked like the town might fall. Then Isabella did something that changed everything. She grabbed a burning brand from the blacksmith's forge and dashed toward the overturned wagon that anchored their main barricade. Before Jake could stop her, she'd set the wagon ablaze. Isabella! What the hell? Trust me, she yelled back, already running toward the next wagon. Jake suddenly understood. The burning wagons created a wall of smoke and flame that channeled Martinez's remaining men into an even tighter corridor. Instead of being able to spread out, they were forced to bunch together, making perfect targets for the townspeople's concentrated fire. The tide turned in that moment. Martinez's men, already demoralized by their heavy losses, broke and ran as the smoke and heat became unbearable. Only Martinez himself remained, standing in the street with his expensive clothes scorched and his face twisted with fury. This isn't over, he screamed. I'll come back with 100 men. Sheriff Morrison's rifle cracked once. Martinez pitched backward off his horse, his threats dying with him in the dust of Esperanza's main street. In the sudden silence that followed, smoke drifted across the battlefield like ghosts seeking rest. The townspeople emerged from their positions, checking on wounded friends and counting their dead. Miraculously, they'd lost only two men, old Senor Martinez, the blacksmith, and Bill Crawford, who ran the general store. Jake found Isabella sitting on the church steps, her rifle across her knees and tears streaming down her soot-stained face. He sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's really over this time." "I know," she whispered, "but the cost—" Jake looked around at the damage. Buildings pocked with bullet holes, two good men dead, families grieving. The price of freedom was always paid in blood and sorrow. "They died protecting their home," he said quietly, "protecting what they loved. There's honor in that." Isabella nodded, wiping her eyes. "My grandfather used to say that some things are worth dying for, but the truly important things are worth living for." "What's worth living for?" Jake asked. Isabella looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flames of the burning wagons. "This, U.S., the future we can build together." Sheriff Morrison approached, his hat in his hands. "Jake, Isabella, the town council had a meeting. We'd like to offer you both permanent positions. Jake, we need a deputy sheriff. Isabella, the school board wants to make you head teacher." Jake looked at Isabella, then at the town they'd fought to defend. For a man who'd spent years running from his past, the idea of putting down roots was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. "What do you think?" he asked Isabella. She smiled, the expression transforming her face from beautiful to radiant. "I think we found our home." As the sun set over Esperanza, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Carter realized that sometimes the best journeys ended exactly where you were meant to be all along. The war was over. Love had won. And in a small town in the middle of nowhere, two broken souls had found the courage to heal together. 6 months later, Esperanza had been rebuilt stronger than before. The bullet holes had been patched, the burned wagons replaced, and life had settled into the peaceful rhythm that small towns cherish. But the most significant change wasn't in the buildings or the streets. It was in the hearts of two people who'd learned that love could bloom even in the harshest soil. Jake stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his string tie for the third time. His hands were steady, steadier than they'd been in years, but his stomach churned with nervous energy. Today was his wedding day, and despite facing down countless gunfighters without flinching, the prospect of saying, "I do," had him more rattled than he cared to admit. A knock at the door interrupted his fidgeting. "Come in." Sheriff Morrison entered, resplendent in his Sunday best and carrying a bottle of whiskey. "Thought you might need some liquid courage, Deputy." Jake had accepted the deputy sheriff position with mixed feelings. Part of him still wanted to drift, to keep moving before the ghost caught up. But Isabella had helped him understand that running from the past only gave it more power over you. "Appreciate it, Ben," Jake said, accepting the offered drink. "But I reckon I need a clear head today." Morrison grinned. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Jake admitted. "Been a bachelor for 3 years. Not sure I remember how to be a husband. From what I've seen, you're doing just fine. That girl lights up like Christmas morning every time you walk into a room." Jake smiled, thinking of Isabella's laugh, the way she hummed while grading papers, how she fit perfectly against his chest when they sat together on the porch swing he'd built behind the schoolhouse. "She's something special, that's for sure. Special enough to put up with a broken-down old cowpoke like you," Morrison teased. "Speaking of which, you better get moving. Bride's waiting at the church, and half the territories come to see you get hitched." Jake checked his appearance one last time, then followed Morrison outside. The street was decorated with ribbons and flowers. Senora Valdez had mobilized every woman in town to make this the wedding Esperanza would remember for decades. The church was packed to the rafters. Ranchers and miners sat next to shopkeepers and farmers, all united in their affection for the couple who'd brought such excitement to their quiet lives. Even some of Jake's old friends had ridden in from distant territories, drawn by curiosity and genuine fondness. Father Miguel, the traveling priest who visited Esperanza quarterly, waited at the altar with his worn Bible and patient smile. Jake took his position beside the altar, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then the church doors opened and Isabella appeared. Jake's breath caught in his throat. She wore a white dress that Senora Valdez and the other women had spent weeks sewing, with lace trim and pearl buttons that caught the light from the stained glass windows. Her dark hair was pinned up with small white flowers, and a veil of Spanish lace, a family heirloom saved from the burning of her family's ranch, framed her face like angel wings. But it was her smile that undid him completely. Radiant, joyful, full of love and promise, and the future they would build together. She walked down the aisle alone. She had no father to give her away, no family left to witness this moment. But as she passed each pew, friends and neighbors reached out to touch her hand, to offer whispered blessings, to show her that she wasn't alone after all. She had a whole town for family now. When she reached the altar, Jake stepped forward to take her hand. Her fingers were steady and warm in his, anchoring him to this moment, this choice, this leap of faith. "Dearly beloved," Father Miguel began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Carter and Isabella Rodriguez, two souls who have found in each other the courage to love again." The ceremony passed in a blur of words and vows and promises. Jake heard himself say, "I do," with a voice that sounded far steadier than he felt. Isabella's voice was clear and strong when she spoke her vows, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "You may kiss the bride," Father Miguel announced with a broad smile. Jake lifted Isabella's veil with hands that trembled slightly, then cupped her face gently and kissed her. The church erupted in cheers and applause, but all Jake could hear was the sound of his own heart finally finding its rhythm again. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town. A mariachi band that had traveled up from Mexico played, while couples danced under the stars. Children ran between the tables, drunk on cake and excitement. Jake and Isabella moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but never straying far from each other's side. They danced to every song, even the fast ones that left them breathless and laughing. As the evening wound down and the last guests began to drift home, Jake and Isabella found themselves alone on the church steps, looking out over the town that had become their home. "No regrets?" Jake asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "Only that we waited so long to do this," Isabella replied, leaning into his warmth. "What about you? Any second thoughts about marrying a woman who's only known you 6 months?" Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The auction, the chase, the battles, the quiet moments that had grown into something beautiful and lasting. "I've been thinking about time," he said finally, "how some folks know each other for years and never really see each other. But then there's people like us who recognize something true right from the start." Isabella turned in his arms to face him. "And what did you recognize in me?" "Courage," Jake said without hesitation. "Strength. The kind of woman who'd stand up to 7 gunfighters rather than let the man she loves face them alone. And I recognized a man who would spend his last dollar to buy a stranger's freedom, then give her his coat without expecting anything in return." They kissed again, soft and sweet under the desert stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, not with loneliness, but with the wild joy of being alive and free. "So what happens now?" Isabella asked. "What do we do with our happily ever after?" Jake grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish and hopeful. "Well, Mrs. Carter, I was thinking we might start with building a house. Something with a big kitchen for you and a workshop for me. Maybe room for a couple of kids running around the yard." "Kids?" Isabella's eyes sparkled with mischief. "And how many kids were you planning on having, Deputy Carter?" "Oh, I don't know. How about we start with one and see how it goes?" Isabella laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet town like music. "I like the way you think, husband." They walked home hand in hand through the empty streets, past the schoolhouse where Isabella would continue teaching, past the sheriff's office where Jake would help keep the peace, past all the ordinary places that had become extraordinary because they were home. Their house, the one they'd rent until they could build their own, sat at the edge of town, close enough to hear the church bells, but far enough out to see the stars without interference. Jake had already moved his few possessions in, and Isabella had added touches that made it feel like a real home. Curtains in the windows, flowers in jars, books on the shelves. On the kitchen table sat a small wrapped package tied with a blue ribbon. "What's this?" Jake asked. "A wedding present," Isabella said, suddenly shy. "I made it myself." Jake unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal with his initials tooled into the cover. Inside, the first page bore an inscription in Isabella's careful handwriting: "For the stories we'll write together. All my love, Isabella Carter." Jake's throat tightened with emotion. "It's perfect, but I'm not much of a writer." "Then I'll help you," Isabella said, taking the journal and turning to the first blank page. "Every good story needs a proper beginning." She dipped a pen in ink and wrote in flowing script. "Once upon a time, in a small town called Esperanza, two broken souls learned that love is the greatest adventure of all." Jake watched her write, marveling at how different his life looked now compared to 6 months ago. Then he'd been a man with no future, haunted by loss and mistakes. Now he was a husband, a deputy sheriff, a member of a community that valued him not for his gun or his past, but for who he chose to be each day. "What are you thinking about?" Isabella asked, looking up from the journal. "Tomorrow," Jake said, pulling her into his arms, "and the day after that, and all the days we'll have together." Isabella smiled and kissed him, sealing the promise they'd made in front of God and man and the whole town of Esperanza. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers and new beginnings. The story that had started with fear and desperation had become something beautiful. Proof that even in the harsh landscape of the frontier, love could take root and flourish. And in a small adobe house on the edge of nowhere, two hearts that had found each other against all odds settled into the sweetest rhythm of all: forever. The schoolhouse bell chimed softly in the evening breeze as Isabella Carter walked across the yard toward home. At 24, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who'd survived hell and built heaven from the ashes. Her white cotton dress, now proper and unstained, swayed gently as she balanced a stack of children's drawings in one arm and cradled her swollen belly with the other. 5 years. Had it really been that long since that terrifying night in Perdition Creek? Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago, other times like yesterday. The scars had faded, both the visible ones on her wrists where the ropes had cut deep, and the invisible ones that had taken much longer to heal. She paused at the white picket fence Jake had built around their property, smiling at the sight that greeted her every evening. Their house sat nestled among cottonwood trees, painted yellow like sunshine, with green shutters that Jake had carved with intricate patterns during the long winter evenings. Flowers bloomed in neat rows along the front porch: roses, marigolds, and the wild desert blooms she'd transplanted from the hills. But it was the man on the porch that made her heart skip, just as it had that first night when he'd stepped through the cantina doors like some avenging angel. Jake sat in his rocking chair, his 5-year-old daughter Elena perched on his lap as he read from a well-worn book of fairy tales. His hair was more silver now, lines deeper around his eyes, but those gray eyes still held the same steady warmth that had saved her soul. The deputy sheriff's badge caught the last rays of sunlight as Elena giggled at whatever story he was telling. "Mama!" Elena scrambled down from her father's lap and ran toward the gate, her dark pigtails bouncing. She had Jake's steady temperament, but Isabella's expressive eyes, a perfect blend of both their spirits. "Careful, pequeña," Isabella called, opening the gate with her free hand. "Remember what Papa said about running when Mama's carrying the baby." Elena slowed to a careful walk, then wrapped her arms around Isabella's legs. "Did the baby move today?" "Can I feel?" Isabella set down her papers and placed Elena's small hand on her belly. Right on cue, their unborn son, they'd felt certain it was a boy, gave a strong kick that made Elena's eyes widen with wonder. "He's gonna be strong like Papa," Elena declared solemnly. "Strong like his sister, too," Jake said, rising from his chair and crossing to them. At 53, he moved with the same quiet confidence, though Isabella sometimes caught him favoring his left leg, where a bullet had grazed him during a cattle rustler incident 2 years back. Jake kissed Isabella's forehead, then her lips, the gesture as natural as breathing after 5 years of marriage. "How were the little ones today?" Miguel Hernandez can finally read a full page without help, and Sarah Beth Morrison drew this. Isabella held up a crayon drawing of a family, a tall man in a hat, a woman in a yellow dress, and a little girl between them, all holding hands under a bright sun. "Looks about right to me," Jake murmured, his arms settling around Isabella's waist. They stood together in the gathering dusk, watching Elena chase fireflies in the yard while the first stars appeared overhead. These quiet moments were what Isabella treasured most. Not the dramatic rescues or the gunfights that had brought them together, but the simple rhythm of daily life they'd built. Morning coffee shared on the porch. Jake reading the territorial newspaper aloud while she graded papers. Elena's bedtime stories that usually involved brave princesses who rescued themselves. "Sheriff Morrison stopped by the office today," Jake said as they walked toward the house. "Got word from the territorial capital. They're thinking about making Esperanza an official county seat." Isabella's eyebrows rose. "Really? That would mean more people, more businesses, maybe even a proper hospital." Jake's expression was thoughtful. "Change is coming whether we want it or not. The railroad survey team was through last month. They're planning a spur line that'll run right through town." Isabella felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Change had never been kind to her before. Every time life had seemed stable, something had shattered it. Her family's farm, her capture, even their early days in Esperanza had been marked by violence. Jake must have sensed her tension because he stopped walking and turned to face her. "Hey, what's that look for? What if things change too much? What if Esperanza becomes like those big towns where people don't know each other? Where a girl could be sold at auction and nobody would care enough to stop it," Jake finished gently. Isabella nodded, unable to voice the fear that sometimes woke her in the night, that their happiness was too fragile, too precious to last. Jake cupped her face in his hands, calloused thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Isabella, listen to me. We're not the same people who rode into this town 5 years ago. You're not that frightened girl, and I'm not that broken-down drifter. We've got roots here, real ones. But what if the sun don't rise tomorrow? What if the stars fall out of the sky?" Jake's voice was patient but firm. "We can't live our lives afraid of maybes, love. All we can do is hold tight to what matters and face whatever comes together." Elena appeared at their side, holding a jar with 3 captured fireflies. "Look, Mama, I caught some stars." Isabella knelt down carefully, one hand on her belly. "They're beautiful, mija. But you know what we do with beautiful wild things?" Elena's face scrunched in concentration, then brightened. "We let them go so they can be free." "That's right." Isabella helped Elena unscrew the jar lid, and they watched the fireflies spiral up into the darkening sky like tiny golden spirits returning home. Later, after Elena was tucked into bed with her favorite doll, and Jake had checked the locks on the doors and windows, old habits died hard. Isabella stood at their bedroom window brushing her long hair. In the mirror, she could see Jake removing his gun belt, something he'd only started doing in the last year as Esperanza had grown more peaceful. "Do you think she'll remember?" Isabella asked quietly. "Elena, I mean. The early days when there was trouble?" Jake hung his gun belt on the bedpost, within reach but no longer worn constantly. "She might remember some, but what she'll really remember is growing up in a house full of love, in a town where people looked after each other. That's not such a bad thing to carry forward." Isabella turned from the mirror to find Jake watching her, with an expression that still made her breath catch. Even after 5 years, sometimes she couldn't quite believe this was her life. This good man, this safe home, this growing family. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Jake replied, pulling back the quilt on their bed. "Both of you, all 3 of you, come October." As they settled into bed, Isabella's head on Jake's shoulder and his hand resting on her belly, she thought about the conversation they'd had about change. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe she wasn't that terrified girl anymore. That girl had been broken by circumstances, defined by what had been done to her. But Isabella Carter, wife, mother, teacher, she was something different, something stronger, something built not from fear, but from choice, from love freely given and received, from a community that had fought for her, and a man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent, and Jake chuckled in the darkness. Already eager to get into the world, he murmured. I wonder what kind of world it'll be for him, Isabella said. Better than the one we grew up in, Jake said with quiet certainty, because we'll make sure of it. Outside their window, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of the night train whistle. Progress and tradition, change and continuity, all mingling together under the vast star-filled sky. And in a yellow house with green shutters, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that some things, love, loyalty, the courage to stand up for what's right, never changed at all. In the morning, there would be lessons to teach and peace to keep. There would be a community to nurture and a future to build. But tonight, there was simply this. Two hearts that had found each other in the darkness, now beating in perfect rhythm as they dreamed of tomorrow. The girl who had once trembled on an auction block was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who would teach her children that they were worth saving, worth fighting for, worth loving, not because of what they could give or what they looked like, but simply because they existed. And in a world that often forgot such truths, that was perhaps the most revolutionary act of all. And so ends the tale of Jake Carter and Isabella Rodriguez, two souls who found each other in the darkest of circumstances and proved that love can bloom even in the harshest desert. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a sword or a gun, but with the courage to open our hearts when we thought they were too broken to love again. In the years that followed, Jake and Isabella became the heart of Esperanza. Jake's reputation as a fair and fearless lawman spread throughout the territory, while Isabella's school grew into one of the finest in the region. Children came from 3 counties to learn from the teacher who spoke 4 languages and could outshoot most of their fathers. They built their dream house on a hill overlooking town, with the big kitchen Isabella wanted and the workshop Jake needed. The yard filled with the laughter of their 4 children. Sarah, named for Jake's first daughter, Miguel, Elena, and little Roberto, who had his father's steady hands and his mother's fearless spirit. Sheriff Morrison eventually retired, passing his badge to Jake with pride. Isabella continued teaching until she was well into her 70s, shaping young minds and proving that education was the greatest weapon against prejudice and fear. Together, they helped Esperanza grow from a dusty frontier settlement into a thriving town where families could build futures and dreams could take root. Jake lived to see the railroad come through, bringing prosperity and connecting their little piece of the world to the larger tapestry of America. He never forgot the lessons learned in those early days, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with compassion and stubborn hope. Isabella often told her students that every person they met was fighting battles they knew nothing about, carrying burdens invisible to the eye. The greatest gift you can give, she would say, is the choice to see the person, not the circumstances. To offer dignity instead of judgment. When Jake passed away at the age of 87, the entire territory mourned. Isabella lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the values their grandparents had fought to protect. Her last words were reported to be, "Tell Jake I'm coming home." They were buried side by side in the Esperanza Cemetery, under a stone that bore simple words, "They chose love." If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about the Jake Carters and Isabella Rodriguez's in your own life. The people who show courage when it would be easier to walk away, who choose kindness when cruelty would be simpler. In our modern world, we still need those who are willing to stand up for what's right, to protect the vulnerable, to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. What did you think of Jake and Isabella's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier. Because out here in the vast spaces between heartbeats and hopes, every story matters, every choice counts, and every heart that refuses to give up makes the world a little bit brighter. Until next time, keep riding toward the sunset. The best stories are always just over the next hill.